session of the Cities for Forest Day. My name is Stuart Ragaluth, and I'm the founder of Revolve Communication Group. Revolve is a partner of Cities for Forests, a network of some 70 cities from around the world, and Cities for Forests is an official partner to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which explains why we are all here to learn more about the ecosystem restoration and everything that it's about. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our three experts who will address you in this order. Tim Christophersen is the head of the Nature for Climate branch at the UN Environment Program. He will introduce the UN Decade more broadly for the non-specialists like myself. Marcos Valderrabano is program manager for the Red List of Ecosystems at IUCN. He will explain some of the more technical details of ecosystem functions and how to avoid ecosystem collapse. And Ashley Brown is camp coordinator and co-founder of the Inspirational Ecosystem Restoration Camps, also known as ERC. Ashley is one of the first ERC campers, and we're excited to have her with us today. Revolve and ERC also work closely together on the spring issue of our quarterly magazine. Some of you may have seen the cover contest with the different camps that culminated in this one winning the most votes. We invite you all to visit our website and to order your copies of Revolve magazine today. The way this will proceed is that our three experts will present in turn. Please listen carefully and send in your questions or comments via the chat and Q&A. If you are watching via the YouTube live stream, we will do our best to integrate your questions as well. If time does not permit to answer all of them, then we will follow up by providing written responses online. At the end of the hour, we will close the panel by showing a 7-minute video of the Birdhouse Ecosystem Restoration Camp in Los Angeles, near the iconic Hollywood sign. So we invite you to stick around until then to watch the first urban ecosystem restoration camp in action. For those of you who are active on social media, please use 3 hashtags. Hashtag Cities for Forest, hashtag Generation Restoration, and hashtag For Nature, which you should see in the chat of this call. On that note, let us begin. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and hi everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to introduce the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. We're already in it. It started in 2021, but the official launch is on the 5th of June. So just in a few weeks from now, and partners like Revolve, Cities for Forests, but also about 50 other partners, and the number is growing quickly, are all gearing up to this global launch on World Environment Day on the 5th of June. Next slide, please. Why a decade on ecosystem restoration? I've chosen this picture to illustrate, basically because our health and well-being and the wealth of our nations depend on nature. Without an intact biosphere, we cannot hope to reach the other SDGs. So investments in nature are essential for reaching all the SDGs, including all the economic related SDGs. Next slide, please. Just the basic facts on the UN Decade. It is based on a unanimous UN General Assembly resolution that was passed on the 1st of March 2019. In that resolution, FAO and UNEP were asked to co-lead the implementation of the decade. We'll launch it in a few weeks from now. We have an advisory board and task forces on best practices, on finance monitoring, science and youth that are all being established at the moment. For example, the one on science is being led by IUCN. Marcos will speak after me. The one on finance is led by the World Bank. Task forces on best practice and monitoring are led by FAO. So we are engaging through those groups also a lot of restoration practitioners across the world. We released our strategy on the 15th of September 2020. That is available on the Decade's website, which you can see on the screen here. And I'm sure the Revolve team will also share that and all the slides with the audience afterwards. We build the UN Decade on existing commitments of the Rio Conventions and the Sustainable Development Goals, and processes that are already quite experienced in restoration, like the Bonn Challenge. So all of that is part of this UN decade on ecosystem restoration. Next slide, please. Our vision for the decade is a world where, for the health and well-being of all life on Earth and that of future generations, the relationship between humans and nature has been restored, and where the area of healthy ecosystems is increasing, where ecosystem loss, fragmentation, and degradation has been ended. In that vision, the first part on the relationship between humans and nature is quite important, and it is also important that we start with and involve cities in that, where now more than half of the world's population lives. Next slide, please. The UN decade has three main goals. The first one is to enhance our global, regional, national, and local commitments and actions for restoration. The second one, increase our understanding of the multiple benefits of successful ecosystem restoration. And we'll put out a UN launch report on the 5th of June around that topic for the launch of the decade, and then apply this knowledge in our education systems and within all the key public and private sector decision-making. Next slide, please. So what can partners and everybody who's interested to be part of this UN decade do? Because this decade is for everybody. It's for all governments and all companies, all cities, all citizens. Before the launch, everybody can already link to the decade through the hashtag Generation Restoration. Your post will appear on our social media wall. You can already download social media resources and an increasing number of other resources, such as guidelines from the decade's website. Over time, we will build that into a digital hub that will allow all of you to find efforts like the ecosystem restoration camps, if you're, for example, interested in a hands-on training on restoration, or Restore, which is another platform being developed if you're interested to learn more about the restoration potential of a given project area. The digital hub will have mechanisms to find interesting projects and to find interested investors. So all of that will be on the UN Decade's website. In time for the launch, we invite all organizations and partners and interested citizens and their groups to prepare and organize events, which could be around any type of ecosystem restoration, could be a cleanup of an urban park or a beach, or it could be a planting of an urban forest or a planting of a non-urban forest. There's many things that can be done together, and all these events would be showcased and highlighted on World Environment Day for the launch of the UN Decade. Next slide, please. So with that, I hand over already to Marcos from IUCN, who will dive deeper into the ecosystems, and we, for the Decade's communication, by the way, use the IUCN ecosystem typology. So Marcos, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thanks a lot. It's indeed very interesting, and yes, you are right. IUCN is participating in some of the task forces trying to support the UN Decade and being in the legwork to make this happen. But what I wanted to present now, it's a bit one step backward. So trying to think about what are these concepts, what are we talking about when we talk about restoration, what do we mean by ecosystem, and what typology, how can we make this happen? So I'm gonna go slightly back. The next slide, please. So what we are observing across the world is that in some cases, in some places of the world, ecosystems are reducing, like this swampy forest in Bangladesh are being replaced by agricultural fields. And this is happening in many places of the world. And the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration intends to address this globally. So we need to start addressing that at the planetary level instead of going at the small pitches. Next slide, please. But what does it mean, ecosystem degradation? In some cases, it's the replacement of an ecosystem by another one. But in other cases, it means losing the capacity of the ecosystem to maintain the native species. In this particular example, for example, in the picture, it's quite obvious that very soon there will no longer be cedar forest in the Moroccan mountains in this image. And all the species that live in those trees and are associated to that will no longer be there, because the environmental conditions, the temperature, the precipitation, but also the soil, due to soil degradation, are no longer maintaining the conditions for those species to be there. Next slide, please. But this brings us to the question of what is an ecosystem, and it's relatively easy to understand that the species go extinct, they just disappear, and but ecosystems don't go extinct, they change into something else, they are transformed into something different. That's why we usually talk about ecosystem collapse, which means that we have replacing a certain ecosystem by something else. Understanding what is an ecosystem and the risk of that ecosystem to collapse help us to take the necessary measures for restoration to bring that within their boundaries where that ecosystem can exist. For that purpose, we are insisting on using some basic definitions. So ecosystems can vary according to the definitions from drop of waters to ocean size. And we're not trying to impose one or another scale of work, but at least taking into consideration that ecosystems are composed by a biotic complex of species, an abiotic environment, salinity, temperature, precipitation, the interactions between the biotic and the abiotic environment, and then a particular physical environment, a place, it is located in one certain place. Next slide, please. One of the particular tool that we are trying to promote for assessing the risk of ecosystem collapse is the red list of ecosystem. It's very similar to the red list of threatened species that you may have already heard about, that measure the risk of a species to go extinct. In this particular case, it measures the risk of ecosystems to collapse, and it provides our already well-known risk category according to the vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered growing risk category that help us to understand how close are we to the border of the cliff. How close are we for falling? Next slide, please. Applying the red list of ecosystems, so assessing what is the risk of ecosystem to collapse, requires or force us to think about what is ecosystem and which typology could we use worldwide. And very recently in December, IUCN launched the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology that is now growing a momentum. There has been an effort for a few years and a few hundred experts around the world to propose a unified typology that we could use for terrestrial, marine, freshwater, subterranean biomes across the planet in a systematic manner. It's a hierarchical classifications, meaning that you could work at a, let's say, terrestrial system, or you could go down and break it down into deserts, polar, or you could break it down into functional groups. And this way, this structure of a tree allows us the flexibility of working at the necessary spatial level that we're mentioning before and addressing the most relevant level. Now you may think, next slide, please. So what is the relevance of this ecosystem typology in the framework of restoration? It may seem a bit outside of the scope of what we're discussing. But so let's look at a particular example. Let's look, for example, at mangroves. You see on the top of the image, there is a map of all around the world where mangroves happen. It's basically on the warm, temperate water zone on the planet. And on the bottom right, you can see an image of a conceptual model of what are the traits that are operating at that ecosystem. The balance between sediments, temperature, storm, and so on are affecting the functioning of that same ecosystem. Now, the value of having a unified system of classifying ecosystem allow us to compare and, for example, learning a restoration action done in a mangrove in the Caribbean might be very useful for a restoration of mangroves in the opposite part of the world, in the Philippines or in Indonesia. And the capacity of learning from each other, especially in the framework of the UN decade, where we are intending to have global impact, it's very relevant. So in the framework of UN decade, where we intend to have a community of learning from each other, and the enabling typology that help us cross information from one place to another is very relevant. I will stop here. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's finished. So I will give now the word to Ashley Brown, who will talk about ecosystem restoration camps. Over to you, Ashley.
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, my name's Ashley Brown, and I am the co-founder and now camp coordinator of the Ecosystem Restoration Camps movement, which is a model for large-scale, bottom-up, grassroots ecosystem restoration and rehabilitation around the world. Next slide, please. In my presentation, I'm going to talk about what we are, what we do, and how we work. Next slide, please. So you may be wondering, what is an ecosystem restoration camp? Well, it's a place for everyday people to gather, learn, and implement ecosystem restoration and regenerative agriculture. The camps are living laboratories for experimenting, researching, learning, and sharing best practice, failures, and breakthroughs with the public, the other camps, and decision makers. And right now we have 37 camp partners around the world. This picture that you can see here is from a camp in Thailand called Utai Forest, and they are rehabilitating a piece of land that was heavily degraded by chemical rice farming. And the photo that you can see at the top is when they first started, and a year later they're already restoring ecosystem function with a new wetland area. Next slide, please. There are camps all over the world, like I said, and they're all very different. One of the beautiful things about this movement is that being an ecosystem restoration camp is quite a broad frame, and it means that as long as it's a place where people are gathering to restore ecosystem functionality of degraded land, you can call yourself a camp. So people could be sleeping in tents, people could be staying in hostels, people could be staying in, the houses of local people. And it's not just international visitors flying in and doing this work, it's people around the world that live on the land that they're restoring. So some of these photos, the one on the far left is from a camp called Contour Lines in Guatemala, where a lot of tropical forest has been cut down by people who are trying to grow food and sell it, mainly chemical corn agriculture. And that is really degrading the land, and it's losing its functionality. So the camp is introducing a regenerative form of agroforestry that can fill in the gaps between the tropical forest fragments with an edible forest system that will increase the livelihood capacity and quality of the people there, whilst also sequestering carbon, increasing biodiversity, reducing erosion, etc. The middle picture is from a camp in Australia called Camp Arcora, and they are based in New South Wales. And again, they are filling in the fragments of the forests around there that are problematic in their health, which we have seen from the wildfires that happened a few years ago. And you can see that people of all generations are getting involved with that work there. Picture on the far right is from the camp in Mexico called Via Organica, and they are holding a pioneer species of native tree called the mesquite, which has a great effect on the ground because as a pioneer species, it produces a lot of seeds. It takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere and puts it into the ground as fertilizer. And the seeds are also edible and can be turned into a type of flour. So it's a product to be sold as well. Next slide, please. The picture on the left is from a camp in Kenya. You could spot the area called Mombasa on the map that Marcus just showed. They are planting mangroves and creating lots and lots of jobs for local people in doing so. And mangrove trees are one of the most effective trees for sequestering carbon on the planet. And the picture on the right is from a camp in Colombia called Hagua Siembra, and they are reforesting areas of tropical forest that have been degraded by cocoa farming with indigenous people that live there. Next slide, please. These, again, are more pictures of the camps. So the ones on the left and the right are from the first ecosystem restoration camp in the south of Spain, and they are replanting the native oak savanna ecosystem there with various native species. And the picture in the middle is a woman planting a tree just after the wildfires in the Paradise area of California 2 years ago. Next slide, please. So the way that the movement works is that the camps are their own local entities that have been started themselves, and there are 3 levels of camp partner, depending on how far along they are. We don't just accept partners that are already at full capacity. We'll accept a lot of different types of people, and we're very proud of how open and inclusive we are. We have 3 stages called seed, seedling, and established. So if you're a seed, you're just an idea. If you're a seedling, you're a startup project. And if you're established, then you're, fully ready at full capacity. And the camps come to us because at the foundation, there's a legal entity registered in the Netherlands who I work for, and we exist to provide these smaller projects with the chance to be globally recognized through events such as this. We help them with fundraising, we give them expertise. We have a very impressive advisory council of very renowned and educated people. The camps have the chance to network with one another. We provide them with training, and we also support them to gather data and build a global data set of what's happening at the camps around the world. We're also building a knowledge hub for camps to be able to teach and learn from each other, to swap tips and techniques, what's working, what's not. And we're building something called a camp matching platform. So it's kind of like the Airbnb of ecosystem restoration experiences. You can type in where you want to go, what sort of experience you want to have, how long you want to go for, etc. And the system will match you with the camp that's looking for someone like you. Next slide, please. I think that might be the end. Yeah. Please get involved. Head over to our website. Everyone's welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashley. Thanks, Marcos. Thanks, Tim, for the introductory presentations, remarks. I'm going to abuse my role as moderator and jump in with some first questions as we gather some from the audience. Shall remind them to just pop their questions into the comment Q&A there. We'll process them and send them on to our panelists. So I'm going to work backwards. And Ashley, if you could, tell us a bit more about the speed at which this has grown. I mean, we got a great flavor of the variety of camps from the images you showed. And I want our audience to understand first how fast this is growing and how exciting it is for local communities to be able to adopt and adapt it without feeling constrained to that one size fits all, right? It's very customizable to local environments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the idea emerged from a man called John D. Liu's head in 2016. We opened the first camp in Spain in 2017. In 2019, we had 6 camps, and then at the end, or the August, September time of 2020, we had 37 and we're planning to scale up to 40 by the end of this year. So it's growing very quickly.
Okay, great. And Marcos, to go one level higher there for the typologies, which is also arguably the more theoretical side of things, as we know, a little bit more abstract, but also equally important. How, I mean, we heard from Tim in his transfer towards you that UNEP is going to be using this kind of typology. Is it also being adapted by or looked at or approved, or what's the process for governments, for example, to learn more about these typologies and to actually implement some measures to avoid that cliff that you mentioned? Let's avoid the cliff. Let's pull back from collapse if possible. So, what's the more political government side of things? If you could give us an insight into that.
Yeah, so the typology intends to be a shared language, similarly to what we have with the species, and when you may have in each country your way of naming a wolf, and it would be a lu or a lobo, or in each, but we all say lupus lupus when we speak in Latin, and we all know that's the same thing, and this intends to be the same thing. So it's not going to replace the national typologies that each country has been using for a long time, and it's embedded in the legislation and everything, but it tends to be a shared space where we can all talk the same language. This is at the national level, so it's not replacing existing classifications. But at the global level, it does have an impact. For example, the United Nations economics evaluations for ecosystems have already adopted that also, the UNCIEA, as the reference classification, and the fact that we can use that when we are gathering many countries together for a shared initiative. That's where it has the potential, because then we can speak the same language. Yeah.
Okay, great. And Tim, going back to the UN decades, to the 7 main areas of ecosystem restoration that you guys have identified. One of them is urban areas, which is of course encouraging for us at Cities for Forests to see that the urban areas is being taken into consideration. The 50% of humanity going towards cities, going towards urban conglomerations, that supposed collective desire to live more in harmony with nature, that ambition of getting there, how much of an emphasis or what kind of message would you send towards cities, towards those urban areas? What is it they can do when you drop ecosystem restoration on them?
Thanks, Stuart. So about 1/3 of all major cities in the world receive their drinking water from forest watersheds. So anybody living in a city and turning on the tap, if you have running water, which is also not the case everywhere, but the water that comes, people should ask themselves where that comes from, because the quality of the water depends directly on the health of the ecosystems. These are just things we took for granted for too long. And now that we are hitting up against the planetary boundaries and we see beginning ecosystems and biodiversity collapse aggravated by climate change, suddenly, even here in Denmark, where I am at the moment, where drinking water quality is something sacred, people realize that due to too much industrial fertilizers in agriculture and too much nutrient runoff, their drinking water is suddenly threatened. So people in cities should pay a lot of attention to ecosystem restoration and be aware what you drink, what you eat, where that comes from, if the supply chains are secure, or if they are, do they have a high carbon footprint? Can you source more locally? And what is the air we breathe? In a lot of cities, including Madrid, thousands of kilos of heavy metals are filtered out of the city air every year by urban trees. If they land in your lungs instead, you would see higher rates of cancer, higher rates of pulmonary disease. So this topic is very relevant for people living in cities. And all of us can do something not only directly for ecosystem restoration, because not all of us have the luxury of being able to go out every day and plant a tree or tend to a river or a beachfront. But what we can do when we live in cities is, of course, to push for the political decisions to be made in favor of healthy and productive ecosystems. And this also relates to one of the questions I saw pop up on the chat of the political will.
Mm-hmm.
It is clear that politicians will only take action once the political will has reached a tipping point. And we are quite close to that tipping point, in a sense, on climate action, increasingly also on biodiversity. So by improving and increasing the connectivity amongst the organizations on this call, and dozens and hopefully at some point hundreds of others, we provide the basis for a increased political will out of an increased political attention to a topic that is fed by a global movement. So I think the ingredients are all coming together. It is highly relevant for anybody living in a city because of the air you breathe, the food you eat, the water you drink, the recreation you have, even the noise, the temperature, they're all partly controlled by a city's ecosystem. So this is definitely highly relevant to people living in cities.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, so you threaded in that first question that came in that is indeed related to the political will. And if the politicians and governments are making the necessary steps towards the commitments of the Paris climate goals, which are the question here. To Ashley and Marcos too, feel free to jump in here. The question is really about what are the main difficulties that remain today. I mean, Tim mentioned the tipping points, but a lot of us saw that tipping point a few years ago, right? So we're kind of wondering what's taking the government so long. What are the main hurdles here that remain in your eyes?
I don't know, Ashley, you want to go or?
I was going to talk about what the hurdles are that the camps movement faces. I think you work more closely with government, so if you want to answer the government question, please do.
Let's talk about what goes well. I think it could take us a very long time, a bit of depressing path talking about what are the problems. But I think it's very inspiring to see initiatives like the UN Decade now forming and trying to awaken everyone in this direction. Part of the challenge of addressing ecosystem degradation is that it is seen as too big for individual country to do anything. So what would be the motivation of me to only work in this line if everybody else around me is not doing anything? It's like the crisis of the commons. The fact of having a UN and a collective effort worldwide, it makes us think that it might be possible to break this inertia and say, no, we are all trying to move in this path. It is worth, the individual efforts are worth it. And so I think that it's very inspiring. We'll stop there, yeah.
Okay, great. Ashley, if you want to pick up on that for the camps and talk about some of the challenges or hurdles that you've been confronted with. And then there's a follow-up question for you and potentially Marcos and Tim about mangroves and wetlands and the importance of those.
So we work with everyday people, and we're getting somewhere with finding ways that they can all help each other in terms of teaching them what the techniques are that they can use to increase and restore the functionality of their landscapes. What's missing is money for these smaller scale initiatives. I think there is money out there, but people tend to want to fund larger restoration projects. And also the main mechanisms that are available for supporting these smaller projects with funding, especially for trees, is that funds that go people that want to fund tree planting want to do so at the cheapest possible price. And often when there are tree planting initiatives happening on land that's really degraded, it costs much more than 20 or 30 cents a tree, which is what the majority of the tree funders that we are talking to are looking for. So that's also quite a big problem, is making people realise what goes into planting, keeping trees alive in places like Murcia in Spain that are so degraded. The organic matter levels are really low, soil biology is non-existent, you know, drought, all of these issues. Yeah, I don't think the general public quite understand what goes into restoring a really degraded piece of land. A lot of people think, oh, I'll plant 1,000 trees and they're all going to be the same species, and you know, so I think there's a bit of work to be done there as well. But I'm hopeful that the people in this call, we're going to be working towards improving these issues.
If I can maybe add to that question, Stuart, I think what is important to keep in mind is that we need to raise this awareness, and we're starting not from zero, but we're starting very low. But if you look back in history and you look back to the beginning of the 20th century, when you would mention something like human rights, and people would say, well, what's that? And why is that important? You know, why should women vote? Who ever heard of that? So you look back at that point in time, and we're at a similar point in time right now with ecological awareness. And if we don't become more ecological literate, then it starts to hurt us already now, because we are part of nature. We're not different from nature. And I mean, I said this on a recent webinar, and I looked up the terms again, just to be very sure. But if you look at the words economy and ecology, of course, they have the same root, which is oikos from ancient Greek, means our common home, or our household, actually. So ecology is the knowledge of our household. Economy is the management of our household, but they're the same thing. But without knowledge, you can't manage. So that the fact that we've forgotten so much about ecology is, some people might see that as a niche issue that, you know, enthusiasts like Marco spend their time and their lifetime doing, but it is fundamental to human existence. And somewhere along the line, ecology and economy got separated, and now the economy is tanking because of ecology. So let's keep in mind that if we want to set the boat right, we first of all need some more ecological literacy in the world.
I like going back to the Greek roots very much, Tim. I'm going to quote you on that for the knowledge and management, ecology, economy. Same coin, different sides, right? Marcos, I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit further here on mangroves, since you showed that map of the world that highlighted the wetland zones, and building on the question coming in from our colleagues from India, is there, I mean, when we think about tropical forests out there, we always think of Amazon, or we think of Borneo, or somewhere where something's burning, right? Or being cut down. Mangroves, from what we just saw, are prevalent along the coast in many areas. How much of this ecology literacy is needed for us to keep expanding on the awareness about mangroves? How important are they?
Mangroves are definitely very relevant for many of the surrounding ecosystems and for the services they provide for humans. That's undoubtful. And it's luckily the awareness about the importance of mangroves is growing very, very much in the last 10 years. We've seen, I mean, probably something that dated back from the tsunamis control, and started being conscious about how important they are, having a living coast to prevent from coast disasters. And we've seen that in particular with mangroves, the awareness about their importance for breeding fishes, for protecting coastal erosion, for providing capturing carbon, it's now more and more in the agendas of governments, and we're seeing a growing number of initiatives worldwide, specifically for mangroves. A growing number of funds are currently targeting mangroves, and it's an iconic ecosystem at the moment. I don't think that's, I think it's going to continue. It's enough inertia, and probably the situation of mangroves will improve in the next years. That's not necessarily the case for many other ecosystems that are also very relevant, but right now they haven't received that attention, or they don't have this inertia and momentum. Think about something like, I don't know, a coastal mudflat. It's much less appealing, the importance of preserving a coastal mudflat where it is stinky and it's not as iconic. But it will come. We need to start with some of those ecosystems like mangroves and wetlands that are now creating this momentum. This creates also the knowledge and seeing that we are achieving somewhere and we are managing to change the trend and bend the curve. Like with the pandemic, we're talking a lot about bending the curve, but we're bending the curve. That it's very encouraging. In keeping going. I don't know if you want to complement, Ashley. I think the question also relates specifically about mangroves and the citizen camps.
Yeah, I was just going to echo what you said, Marcus, about the functions that mangroves provide and offer to biodiversity, including humans. I think you've covered it pretty nicely. Was there a specific question about Camp Mombasa mangroves in Kenya? I haven't been reading the questions.
There was not specifically about that, but feel free to shed light on that example.
So it was started by a young man who lives in Mombasa, and he was learning more and more about how important mangroves are, and started his own initiative called the Brain Youth Group. And he started going out and planting the mangrove seedlings, which are just like sticks that you just stick in the mud. So it's a very straightforward way of replanting them. And he has been making the most of these funds that are now available for this iconic ecosystem, as Marcus said, and has managed to use those funds to pay tens of people that also live in that area to go out and do this planting. So now there are like 30 or 40 people that all work for the Brain Youth Group who are going around and planting mangroves. And because they're being paid for it, their interest in mangroves as an ecosystem has increased, and they've become real champions of this work, which is really great. Okay.
And to stick with the economy side of the coin, of the ecos coin that Tim mentioned, it was brought to our attention this morning in the press conference, Tim and others who may want to respond, that UNEP came out with a report in March saying that less than 20% of COVID recovery finance can be considered green. Can you give us some insights into what that means, and if it's as dire as we seem to be told, 20%?
Yeah, thanks. So 2 weeks ago, UNEP came out with a report to look at the current economic stimulus packages, and of the slightly over $15 trillion that are being programmed at the moment, almost 2 trillion alone in the US, there's only about 18% that you could consider green in some way, and much less of that even considered towards ecosystem restoration or investments in nature. So there's a huge potential to do better, because in economic stimulus, restoration can quickly create a lot of rural jobs in areas where unemployment is usually high anyway, and right now is through the roof. So we can do better with our economic stimulus packages. But also looking at government subsidies across the board, and this relates to a question that came in the chat. I don't know if you, I think it's moved to the answered section, but you can still see it there. About the missing middle of restoration implementers. Governments can, of course, choose to subsidize or disincentivize all kinds of things. And we have to be careful not to see everything through the lens of the economy. Because governments, of course, incentivize a lot of things that make sense in the bigger picture, but don't necessarily make economic sense in the short term. For example, if a country has a lot of islands, connecting all of them by ferries to the mainland doesn't make a lot of economic sense. Yet most countries choose to do that. If a country like Russia or Canada is, very far flung, it would make a lot more economic sense to only have people live in Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, and maybe Vancouver. And the majority of people live there, but Canada incentivizes that there's also infrastructure in the rest of this huge country, even though the short-term economic gain is not there. We should see investments in nature and in restoration in the same way, that even though there might be things that pay in the short term a higher economic dividend, we have to invest in that essential infrastructure for social cohesion, for all the SDGs. And finally, to that question of the missing middle and many of the restoration implementers not being connected to these global processes and the UN and the high-level political forum on the SDGs and all these meetings that we used to attend before COVID. And I think it's essential for us to recognize what the digitization of the world actually means, because the decision making that used to only happen in those kinds of power structures can now happen in a much more broader and much more inclusive way, because it is much easier to reach many people instantaneously and have them involved. So for the UN decade, the main investment we're actually making, and we don't have a lot of money either, but we have some, and one of the main investments we're making is to build a digital hub that will allow anybody, whether they're a school teacher from northern Nigeria and wants to plant an apple orchard, or they're a CEO of a Forbes 500 company wanting to view the best ecosystem restoration projects for possible investments, that will allow people to go to that hub, find what they need, like sort of a Yelp for restoration, and then go further to the resource that can help them. So with the traffic that we expect on the 5th of June, we will then redirect that to existing hubs and platforms like ecosystem restoration camps and others, depending on what they're looking for, because people are looking for different things. And we expect in the course of this year that there will be a lot more people looking up what restoration is, how they can get involved, how they can donate money, where they can find projects, how they can start up their local restoration initiatives. So we want to be able to have a one-stop shop where people can find the answer and then send them onwards to Marcos if they're interested in the typology, or send them onwards to Ashley if they're interested in starting an ecosystem restoration camp. So this missing middle, the answer to that is the digitization of the world. Gives us enormous opportunities.
That sounds very exciting, Tim, and we will try to promote that as best we can from our side through Revolve and Cities for Forests and the networks that we have going. A last question from our audience is somewhat related to that. It's how can we utilize AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to expedite ecosystem restoration efforts? It sounds like a rather golden bullet question. I'm not sure anyone has the answer, but if you guys want to jump in, go for it. Go ahead.
So we have partnered with an organization called Zendesk, who have help desk software, and they're based in California, and they've, since the latest wildfires, found out about us and have donated their time and software to us so that we can create this help center for the camps. And the way it's going to work is the camp will write in a question, either another camp will answer them, or one of our experts will find them an answer, and then that answer will be saved into an online library that is managed by an AI. So the next time someone asks the same question, it will be the AI librarian that is rifling through the answers and finding the answer that works best. So, as it gets more and more filled up, there'll be less and less need for human intervention. So that's one example.
I mean, we of course work with AI. Sorry, Marcus, I think you want to come in on that as well. But with Google Earth and the underlying computing power that we're already using through FAO and other organizations for restoration mapping, that is of course already being utilized. The one thing I'm very skeptical about is the use of drones for tree planting, which got a lot of hype, but we have to remember that restoration is first and foremost a social endeavor. Drones don't really have social skills. So you need to really look at where this makes any sense at all, if it does as a tool for restoration. But mostly the factors that drive degradation are human factors that need to be addressed and changed in a new social compact. And drones have very limited use for that. Sorry, Marcus, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, but you expressed it much better than I would have. I fully agree on what you said. What we've been using computational power for is mostly for monitoring restoration. So IUCN has, for example, the barometer of ecosystem restoration that use satellite images and so that we can learn of what is functioning and what is not, and how much impact we are having and to what degree. And we are at the infancy of the possibilities of learning from satellite and remote sensing, and in general, the possibilities of using computer power for helping us learning from our mistakes. It's in the infancy. We probably see that growing in the next years. But I agree that this will help us learn and change, but the action and the decisions have to be humans.
Okay, thanks Tim and Marcos and Ashley. I want to give ERC the last word here in sending a message towards our cities as part of Cities for Forests in what are the steps that they can take to join an ERC. Are there some training programs coming up? Just walk us through it in a minute or two, and then we'll follow up with all of you after this call and in the coming week or so. And we'll go immediately after Ashley's response into the video of the birdhouse in Los Angeles. So we won't, there's another question that came in, but it's more general, so I'll share it with the panelists afterwards. And when the video starts, you guys stay on or leave or watch to the end. That will be the end of our panel. We're going to end with a nice warm feeling video of ERC in action in LA near the Hollywood sign, as I mentioned, which we want to send a very positive message to the world. So Ashley, the last words are to you, and then we'll turn on the video.
Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of what people in cities can do, as an individual, you can find a project, a camp that is based in a city, but right now there are only really a handful, and they're in the US, so that only really speaks to US citizens or people traveling to the US. But I thought I'd give you an example of what these urban camps are doing and how they're operating, to give hopefully some inspiration to people listening as to how you could do this yourself. So the birdhouse you're going to see a little video of later, they have a centre, which is a piece of urban land that's a small oasis in the city, that they have been planting both edible and native, and sometimes both, plants there, and then using them in a variety of ways. They sell seeds, they sell seedlings, they make tea out of the plants, and they have a choir. It's like a community centre basically, and they also use that place for training people in the different restoration techniques that they do, and then they have relationships with other landowners in the city. And those landowners give over their land, you know, that could be your back garden or it could be acres, depending on how much space. They also work with local municipalities on public land as well. And they So they have their central hub where they train people, and then they go out to these other pieces of land and implement that restoration work. And that's a model for urban areas that works really well. And there's another partner in the Santa Cruz, Santa Barbara area that wants to do the same, that's just applied to become a camp, and we're going to be talking to them. And they want to specifically go out into the burn zones, both to restore the land that's been burned. I mean, the people who applied to become a camp, their own house was burnt down. So they're, you know, they're full of, of hope that this is going to reduce the trauma that lives within those communities because their land is so degraded. And they want to mitigate fire risk from happening again, and then restore the forest that has been burnt down. Yeah, so it's very powerful and profound what's going on.
So build back better with nature.
Yeah, and the communities there are like, yeah, let's do it. You know, a call went out, 3,000 people signed up saying that they were interested. It's like kind of make or break time in some places now. And we have an online course that runs, it started in January. The next round is starting on the 20th of September. And one of the modules in that course is restoration in cities. And it looks at 4 examples of different types of restoration. One is restoring urban waterways. So building floating habitats along urban waterways like canals, rivers, etc. And one looks at human settlements. How can houses be used to restore land around them? One looks at this model called tiny forests, which is growing a native forest in a small area of land, you know, it could be 10 by 10 meters squared. And then one also looks at urban food growing and how that can be done in a regenerative way. And then if you're interested in learning how to design an ecosystem restoration project, then you'll have the chance to do so in the 5th module. And the course is very affordable. The whole thing only costs about £800. So I recommend checking that out as well if you're interested. It's on our website.
Thank you, Ashley. We certainly will. Thank you, Tim, for joining us today. It's been an honor. Thank you, Marcos. A pleasure. We're going to start the video now, and I hope everyone enjoys. Thank you for joining us today.